Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit the bell for new stories. Dr. Noah Klein, an esteemed human doctor stationed on the intergalactic medical ship Orion, had seen his fair share of strange alien ailments. But nothing prepared him for the request he was about to receive. The alien woman who entered his examination room had an air of urgency about her, a commanding presence that even the seasoned human physician couldn't help but notice. She was tall, her skin a smooth blend of shimmering silver and deep violet, and her eyes, large and reflective, almost seemed to flicker with starlight. The name she had given him was Zyra, a representative of the Andar, a species known for their advanced bioengineering and complex social structures. Yet, despite their advanced technology, Zyra had come to him with a problem that not even her people could solve. The ship's automated systems had flagged her for an emergency consultation as soon as she arrived. But Dr. Klein had no idea what to expect beyond the usual medical protocols. He had read the brief provided to him by the Orion's data core. Zyra was suffering from a reproductive complication, but the specifics were vague. Her species, though biologically similar to humans in some respects, was vastly different in others. They had evolved without the need for traditional biological reproduction, relying instead on genetic harvesting and cloning. But something had gone awry in Zyra's recent pregnancy, and the child she carried was facing a grave danger. Zyra's eyes locked onto his as she spoke, her voice a mix of authority and desperation. "Doctor, I require your expertise. Our medical technologies are insufficient to resolve my condition. You must help me, for the sake of my child." Noah was taken aback by her directness but maintained his composure. He gestured for her to sit, his mind racing through the medical data he had absorbed about her species. "What seems to be the problem, exactly?" Zyra hesitated, her gaze darting to the sterile white walls of the room. "It is difficult to explain. My species has evolved in such a way that reproduction is no longer a natural process. We have perfected our genetic code over millennia, but I, unlike most of my people, have chosen to carry a child. This, I thought, would be a simple procedure. But something is wrong." Noah furrowed his brow, confused by the ambiguous explanation. "You're saying this is a natural pregnancy, but it's not?" Zyra nodded gravely. "Correct. Our reproductive systems were designed to grow embryos through synthetic means. I had expected a controlled birth, a sterile process free from the complications of biological reproduction. But instead, I have begun to carry a hybrid." Noah's confusion deepened. "A hybrid? Of what?" "A hybrid between myself and a human," Zyra continued, her voice growing softer. "I know the implications of this. It is something that our people have long feared. The mixing of our genetic material with yours is considered dangerous. It could destabilize both our species' genetic lines." Noah blinked, trying to process the enormity of what she was saying. A hybrid child, half alien, half human? He had read theoretical studies on the concept of cross-species genetics, but he had never encountered a real-life case. His medical training had not prepared him for something like this. He leaned forward, his voice filled with curiosity and caution. "Are you saying that the pregnancy is unstable? That the child might not survive?" Zyra nodded again, her eyes glowing with the faintest hint of sorrow. "Yes, the embryo is rejecting the genetic code of both species. It is a delicate balance. If we do not act quickly, the child will not survive. And I will not survive the process either." Noah's heart skipped a beat. The stakes were higher than he had anticipated. He had dealt with alien physiology before, but this was uncharted territory. He couldn't let this woman die, and he couldn't let the child perish either. But what could he do? His knowledge of human genetics was vast, but alien biology was an entirely different beast. "We can try a procedure, a transfusion of sorts," Noah suggested, his mind racing. "But I would need to understand your biology better. Specifically, how your body functions in this hybrid state. If the embryo is rejecting both species' codes, I might be able to correct the imbalance." Zyra stood, her posture as poised as ever, though her voice carried a sense of urgency. "I will allow you to study me, doctor. But be warned, I do not have much time. The child grows weaker by the day. You must act quickly. Noah felt a surge of responsibility flood over him. This was his chance, his only chance, to make a real difference. He could not fail her. He couldn't fail the child. As Zyra offered herself for study, Noah began to prepare for the most difficult and unprecedented challenge of his career. Little did he know, this alien woman's problem would not only alter the course of medical history, but it would also set him on a path that would lead to a gift that would change his life in ways he could never have imagined. Dr. Noah Klein had never been one to shy away from challenges. In fact, his career had been built on solving the unsolvable, healing the unhealable. But as he stood in the examination room, surrounded by holographic scans of Zyra's alien biology, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on the precipice of something far bigger than he had ever anticipated. Zyra had been surprisingly cooperative, submitting herself to a thorough examination without hesitation. Her body, despite its alien nature, seemed to follow biological principles that Noah could understand on the surface. But as he began to map her genetic structure, he noticed discrepancies that defied all logic. The very DNA sequence that made up Zyra's species was a marvel of bioengineering, a tightly woven code designed for efficiency and resilience. But embedded within it was something new, something foreign, human DNA. The hybridization between human and Andar was unlike anything Noah had encountered before. The codes weren't merely mingling. They were clashing, a silent battle raging within her cells. His holographic display flickered as he ran diagnostics, and for a moment, he thought the system might crash from the complexity of the task at hand. "Doctor, is it working?" Zyra's voice broke through his concentration. She stood just a few feet away, her violet eyes watching him intently. There was no hint of fear in her posture, but the quiet concern in her tone was unmistakable. Noah glanced at her, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. "It's more complicated than I thought. Your body's genetic material is rejecting the hybrid cells, but the human DNA is somehow causing a sort of imbalance. It's like your body doesn't know how to integrate it properly." Zyra tilted her head slightly, processing his words. "What do you mean by imbalance?" "I mean that it's as if your body is fighting the hybrid child instead of nurturing it," Noah explained, pacing slowly. "The human DNA, despite its compatibility with your species, is destabilizing the cellular structure. The issue isn't just biological, it's systemic. Your immune system doesn't recognize the child as part of you. That's why it's rejecting it." Zyra was quiet for a moment, her expression unreadable. "So, there is no cure?" she asked, her voice surprisingly calm despite the gravity of her words. "No, that's not what I'm saying," Noah replied quickly. "We're not out of options yet. There's a procedure I can try, a kind of genetic therapy. It might not be perfect, but it's our best shot." Zyra's eyes narrowed slightly, her body language rigid. "And if this fails?" Noah met her gaze with a firm resolve. "We'll cross that bridge when we get there. But for now, I'm focused on saving you both. I'm not giving up." She regarded him for a long moment, as if weighing his words carefully. Finally, she spoke. "Very well, doctor. I place my trust in you." Noah immediately got to work, running a series of genetic treatments designed to stabilize Zyra's hybrid pregnancy. His plan was to use an advanced gene editing procedure to reinforce the compatibility between the human and Andar DNA. He would need to alter the child's genetic structure while also recalibrating Zyra's immune system so that it could recognize the hybrid child as part of her. The procedure would require precision and careful monitoring. One wrong move and he could lose both mother and child. The pressure was immense, but Noah was determined. He set up a series of medical modules around Zyra, preparing to inject a custom-tailored serum into her bloodstream that would reprogram her immune system. "Are you ready?" Noah asked, his voice steady but tinged with anticipation. Zyra nodded, her face impassive. "I trust you, doctor." With a deep breath, Noah activated the first phase of the procedure. He injected the serum into Zyra's arm, watching as it rapidly spread through her circulatory system. The holographic readouts above her shifted as her body began to respond, slowly adjusting to the genetic treatment. For a moment, Everything seemed to be working as expected. The scans began to stabilize, and the hybrid child's heart rate, though weak, showed signs of improvement. Noah's breath caught in his throat as the numbers began to align. He could feel the weight of this moment, the success hanging just out of reach. But then, just as the readings began to stabilize, Zyra's body convulsed. Her eyes widened, and she gasped, her entire form trembling as if under an immense pressure. "Zyra!" Noah shouted, rushing to her side. Her breathing became shallow, and her voice broke through in pained whispers. "Something's wrong, doctor. The child is too much." Noah's heart pounded as he scanned the readouts again. What had gone wrong? The procedure had been designed to heal, not harm. He immediately halted the injection, analyzing the situation. The genetic material from the human DNA had begun to react violently with Zyra's biological systems. It was as if her body had reached a breaking point, a clash between her species' advanced bioengineering and the unpredictable nature of human genetics. The hybrid was more than just a combination of two species. It was something entirely new, something that neither side could control. In that moment, Noah knew what had to be done. He had to take a more drastic approach, one that had never been attempted before, combining the genetic healing serum with a synthesized human enzyme capable of overriding Zyra's immune system. This enzyme would force her body to accept the hybrid child, but it would come with risks. He looked up at Zyra, her eyes now filled with silent understanding. "I need to do something more intense," he said softly, his voice steady despite the rising tension. "It might be the only way to save you both. Are you willing to go through with it?" Zyra nodded, a faint glimmer of trust in her eyes. "Do what you must, doctor." Noah's hands trembled as he prepared the final serum. He injected the enzyme into Zyra's bloodstream, holding his breath as he waited for the results. It was a gamble, but for the first time since Zyra had arrived, Noah felt a strange sense of certainty. The road ahead was dangerous, but it was a road he was willing to walk. The serum injected into Zyra's bloodstream began to take effect almost immediately. At first, the changes were subtle. Her breathing steadied, and her trembling eased as her body adapted to the foreign enzyme. But Noah knew better than to let his guard down. He watched the medical monitors closely, analyzing the fluctuating readouts and making adjustments as needed. For a moment, there was a calm, a fragile peace. But Noah's heart sank as he saw the hybrid child's heart rate spike dramatically. The readings were erratic, too fast, then too slow. Zyra's immune system, now overwhelmed with the foreign compounds in her body, was beginning to break down in places. He couldn't afford to let it go on for much longer. "Doctor, I feel strange," Zyra whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and uncertainty. Noah rushed to her side, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Stay with me, Zyra. Just a little longer. The procedure is working, but your body is still adjusting. You're going to be fine." Her eyes locked with his, the intensity of her gaze unwavering. "And what of the child?" she asked quietly, as if the question had been eating at her from within. Noah hesitated. He had prepared himself for the possibility of failure, but he hadn't prepared for the weight of this moment. The risk of death was tangible, yet there was still hope. The child wasn't just any child. It was a hybrid, an unprecedented blend of human and Andar genetics. If it survived, it would be the first of its kind, and the consequences of that survival were immense, not just for Zyra and the child, but for both species. A new path, a new future could emerge from this, if they could get through this crisis. "I'm doing everything I can," Noah said, his voice unwavering despite the pressure. "If we succeed, you both will survive. But I can't guarantee it." Zyra nodded slowly, her breathing shallow. "If you must choose, doctor, choose the child." The words hit Noah like a physical blow. Her eyes were locked on his, filled with an unspoken depth of trust. But there was also something else, something he couldn't fully grasp. She wasn't just submitting to the procedure. She was surrendering herself entirely, preparing herself for the worst. The decision was already made in her mind. "No," Noah said sharply, his voice soft but insistent. "We're not giving up on you. Not yet." Zyra's lips twitched in what could almost be considered a smile. It is a sacrifice I am willing to make. If it means that the hybrid will live, I accept the risk. The words stung, but Noah didn't have time to dwell on them. He had to focus. He knew that Zyra's acceptance of the situation might make things easier emotionally, but it also meant that he was carrying the weight of two lives in his hands. One of them so fragile it was barely a heartbeat, the other, a full-grown being who had the strength of her entire species. He worked quickly, recalibrating the medical devices to increase the synthesis of the enzyme, desperately trying to correct the imbalance between Zyra's body and the child. The hybrid's DNA was more unstable than he'd realized. Perhaps the integration of human DNA was too foreign for her species to accept, even with the enzymes to stabilize it. "Noah, please," Zyra gasped suddenly, her voice straining with effort. I can feel it. It's working. The child." Before she could finish, the heart rate of the hybrid child spiked again. Noah's eyes flicked to the monitor, but this time it wasn't the typical erratic spike. The child's heart was beating at a steady pace. His growth seemed to stabilize, but Zyra's condition was still deteriorating. No, Noah muttered, his mind racing as he checked Zyra's vitals. Her blood pressure was dangerously low. The strain of carrying the hybrid child was taking its toll on her body. "Zyra, I need you to stay with me. Your vitals are dropping. You need to rest, you need to." Zyra's eyes fluttered open, her expression still calm, but now her voice was barely a whisper. "Doctor, I know what must be done. You must promise me that you will protect the child. Do not let it die." Noah felt the pressure in his chest tighten. This wasn't just about medicine anymore. It was about a promise, a duty that went beyond science, beyond his role as a doctor. He was now the guardian of this life, one that was unlike any he had ever encountered. He could not let it die. He would not. "I promise, Zyra," he said, his voice low and firm. "I will protect both of you. You will not die." But the words felt hollow even to him. He didn't have the luxury of promises, only results. And right now, all he had was the hope that his interventions would be enough. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The room was thick with tension, the air heavy with uncertainty. Zyra's condition remained precarious, but there was hope for the child. The monitors confirmed that the hybrid heart was still beating, still fighting, and for the first time, Noah allowed himself to believe that they could make it through this. "Is it done?" Zyra's voice broke through the quiet. Noah took a deep breath, running one last series of checks on the medical monitors. Her vitals were stabilizing, albeit slowly, and the hybrid child's heart continued to beat steadily. They weren't out of danger, but they were no longer on the edge of a cliff. "We've made it through the worst of it," Noah said, his voice thick with relief. "But you still need to rest. Your body needs time to recover." Zyra's gaze softened, a faint but grateful look in her eyes. I can rest. As long as the child lives." Noah gave her a reassuring nod, his mind still racing as he processed the enormity of what had just transpired. He had saved them, at least for now. The hybrid child had a chance, and Zyra had survived the procedure, though she would need months of care to fully heal. But as he looked at her, lying there on the examination table, Noah couldn't help but wonder what the future held for the hybrid child. What kind of life would it lead? Would it be accepted by both species? And what about Zyra? What would her people think of her choice? For now, Noah knew that he had done his best. And for the first time, he allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope for both the child and Zyra. The days following the procedure were a blur of medical checks, careful monitoring, and long hours spent at Zyra's side. She had stabilized, though her recovery was slow and fraught with complications. Her body was not built for the strain that carrying a hybrid child imposed on it, but she was nothing if not resilient. Every time Noah saw her eyes open, still luminous and filled with an eerie calm, he felt the weight of the responsibility he had taken on. The hybrid child, too, seemed to be thriving, its heartbeats regular and strong. It was growing, developing faster than any human child Noah had ever seen, but it was still too early to know exactly what kind of life it would lead. His mind raced with questions. What kind of creature would this child become? Would it be a bridge between two species, a symbol of unity, or would it be something entirely new, a hybrid that would never truly belong to either side? Zyra's condition, however, was still fragile. Noah had kept her under observation, administering carefully calibrated treatments to help her body adapt to the changes wrought by the procedure. Despite the initial success, she remained weak, and he found himself constantly adjusting the healing regimen to support her immune system. As time went on, Noah could see that Zyra's strength was returning, albeit at a pace that left him constantly on edge. She needed to heal, but her people's expectations weighed heavily on her. It was late one evening when Noah sat at the edge of Zyra's recovery bed, reviewing her medical charts. The soft hum of the Orion's advanced medical equipment was the only sound in the sterile room. Zyra's breathing was steady, and for the first time since the procedure, she appeared to be sleeping peacefully. Noah allowed himself a rare moment of rest. The past few days had been grueling, and he hadn't allowed himself to sleep more than a few hours at a time. The emotional and physical toll of saving 2 lives had exhausted him, but the weight of his thoughts kept him awake. Suddenly Zyra stirred. Her violet eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment, they locked onto his. He could see the gratitude in them, but also something deeper. An unspoken question, one that had lingered since she had first entrusted her life to him. "Doctor," Zyra whispered, her voice hoarse but clear. "I wish to know what happens now. What will the child become?" Noah sat up straighter, his heart skipping a beat. He had been wondering the same thing. There were so many uncertainties, so many variables that had yet to unfold. But Zyra had a right to know. She had trusted him with her life, and now, as her strength returned, she had to face the future. Not just for herself, but for the child she carried. "I don't know," Noah admitted, his voice quiet. "The child is still developing. We've managed to stabilize the hybridization process, but its growth is unprecedented. Faster than anything I've seen before. I've been monitoring its progress, but it's different from any species I've encountered. We'll need time to learn more about it." Zyra's eyes closed briefly, processing his words. "Will it be accepted by my people? Will they see this child as a threat?" Her voice wavered slightly, betraying the underlying concern she had kept hidden behind her composed facade. Noah could sense the fear in her question, the vulnerability beneath her strength. He wasn't sure what to tell her. "I don't know what your people will think. I don't know how they'll react to a hybrid. Your people have worked so hard to perfect your genetic code for centuries. I don't think they'd easily accept something that goes against what they've worked so hard to create." Zyra's gaze softened, and she shifted slightly on the bed. "The Andar do not easily accept change. We value purity, control over evolution. But this child is not just a new life. It is a new beginning. It is something my people cannot ignore." Noah nodded, the weight of her words settling on him. He had always thought of medicine as a field defined by logic and science, but he was beginning to realize how deeply intertwined it was with philosophy, culture, and politics. This child, if it survived and grew, would be a symbol, a living embodiment of the convergence between two species. What would the Andar do with that symbol? Would they welcome it, or would they view it as a betrayal of everything they had worked toward? "I will protect it, Zyra," Noah said firmly. "I'll protect both of you. I'll do everything I can to ensure the child has a future. But I can't promise how the rest of your people will react." Zyra's lips pressed together in a tight line, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Determination, perhaps, or acceptance. "The future is uncertain for us all. But one thing is certain. The choice has already been made." The days stretched on, and Noah continued to oversee Zyra's recovery, all the while keeping a close eye on the hybrid child's growth. With each passing day, the child's development accelerated. It was growing faster than anything Noah had ever studied, gaining size, strength, and even cognitive abilities. But the child was still a mystery. Its genetic makeup was still a puzzle that needed solving. Noah worked tirelessly, poring over data and conducting further experiments. But the more he learned, the more questions arose. Zyra, though weak, was persistent. She wanted to learn more about the child, to understand what it would mean for the future of both species. But as she recovered, she also became more restless. It was clear that the time for waiting was drawing to a close. She was preparing herself for the next phase of her life, a life that might involve either acceptance or rejection by her people. One evening, as Noah prepared to conduct another round of tests on the hybrid child, Zyra spoke again. Her voice was more resolute than before. "Doctor, I must return to my people," she said quietly. Noah froze, looking up from the medical console. "What do you mean? You're still recovering. You can't." "I must go," she interrupted gently, but firmly. "I have given my people time to reach out to me, to offer their guidance, their judgment. But that time has passed. I can no longer hide from the truth. I must face them." Noah felt a pang of fear. He knew what this meant. If Zyra returned to her people, the child, his patient, his responsibility would be exposed to their judgment. There was no telling what they might do, no telling if they would view the hybrid as an abomination or a miracle. But Noah also knew there was no stopping her. Zyra had made her decision, just as she had before, when she had entrusted her life and the life of her child to him. "I will go with you," Noah said suddenly, surprising even himself. "You don't have to face them alone." Zyra looked at him, a hint of something, perhaps gratitude, perhaps something deeper, flashed in her eyes. "You would do that? Risk your life to stand by me?" Noah nodded, his resolve strengthening. "I swore to protect both of you. If the child is to have a future, if it is to be accepted, then I must help you show them that it is worthy of life. It's the only chance we have." Zyra studied him in silence, her eyes reflecting something unreadable. Finally, she nodded, and in that moment, Noah knew that the path ahead would be even more uncertain, but also more necessary than ever. Together, they would face the unknown. The journey to the Anar homeworld was long and uncertain, a test of both Zyra's resolve and Noah's commitment to the promise he had made. Though Zyra had recovered much of her strength, she remained emotionally guarded, her thoughts constantly returning to the child growing inside her. It was clear that her people had never encountered a hybrid like this before, and the weight of what lay ahead rested heavily on her shoulders. Noah, too, felt the enormity of their mission. The child, a living symbol of the convergence between human and Anar DNA, would either be embraced as a bridge between worlds or rejected as an aberration. He had no illusions about the risks they faced. He had studied the Anar for years, and while their technology was far more advanced than humanity's, their culture was deeply rooted in tradition. A hybrid born of two species was more than just a biological curiosity. It was a challenge to everything the Anar held dear. Their ship, the Orion, was a marvel of human engineering, equipped with the latest in interstellar technology. But even so, it felt small compared to the vastness of space. Zyra sat at the helm, her posture tense as she prepared to make the final jump into Anar space. Noah sat beside her, the weight of the unknown pressing down on him. The ship's AI hummed softly in the background, preparing for the arrival. "I've made my peace with what comes next," Zyra said quietly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. Noah turned his gaze toward her, studying her face. There was a quiet strength in her eyes, but also something else, a hint of fear that she tried to conceal. "You're not alone in this," he said softly. "I'll be with you, every step of the way." Zyra didn't respond immediately, her attention focused on the navigational controls. After a long pause, she nodded. "You don't understand, Doctor. This is not just about me. This child, it represents a future that neither I nor my people are prepared for. You're asking me to bring something into this world that will change everything. For better or worse." Noah could feel the gravity of her words. The child she carried was not just a life, it was a potential catalyst, a force that could either unite or divide their worlds. And now, as they neared the Anar homeworld, there was no turning back. As the Orion entered Anar space, the silence between them deepened. The view outside the ship's viewport was breathtaking. Vast nebulas and distant stars stretched across the dark expanse, their soft light bathing the ship in a cool, otherworldly glow. The Anar homeworld, a planet of stark beauty, loomed ahead, its surface dotted with sprawling cities and ancient structures. Zyra had told Noah much about her world, about the pride her people took in their perfection, their unyielding control over their genetic code. But Noah was about to see it firsthand. Approaching the capital, the ship's AI announced, its voice smooth and monotone. Entering planetary orbit in 30 minutes. Zyra's jaw tightened, and her fingers gripped the armrests of her seat. The tension was palpable. "The council will be waiting," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Noah leaned forward, his hands folded in his lap. "The council? Who are they?" Zyra's gaze drifted to the view screen, watching as the planet grew larger in the distance. "The High Council of the Andar is the governing body of our people. They are the ones who enforce our laws, our culture, our traditions. They will decide the fate of the child. And they will decide my fate, too." Noah's heart sank. It was clear that this was not just a matter of whether the hybrid child would be accepted. It was about Zyra's place in her society, her future. If the child was rejected, she could face exile or worse, punishment for defying the natural order of her people. She had gambled everything on the belief that the hybrid could survive, that her choice would be justified. "Are you ready for this?" Noah asked quietly. Zyra's eyes met his, and for the first time, she allowed herself a small, weary smile. "There is no other choice." The Orion touched down on the surface of Andar with a soft thud, the landing pads absorbing the weight of the ship as they settled into the sleek, metallic platform. Outside, the Andar capital city rose in sharp, angular structures, buildings made of a material that shimmered in the ambient light, giving them an ethereal, almost crystalline appearance. The air was thin and cold, the atmosphere of the planet unforgiving to unaccustomed lungs. As the ship's hatch opened, Noah felt a rush of cold air sweep in. He stepped out first, followed by Zyra, her tall, lithe figure cloaked in a shimmering fabric that reflected the light like liquid silver. She had chosen to wear the traditional garb of her people, marking her as a member of Andar society, yet also signaling her return to face her destiny. The robes were elegant but not soft. Sharp like her people themselves, they were met by a procession of Andar officials, led by the High Counselor, a towering figure whose presence seemed to demand reverence. His skin was an opalescent shade of blue, and his eyes glowed faintly, a sign of his status. Behind him stood the rest of the council, a group of somber-faced individuals whose expressions betrayed nothing of what they truly thought. Zyra stepped forward with measured grace, but Noah noticed the tightness in her shoulders. She had not spoken of her past much, but it was clear that her relationship with the council was strained. She had once been a promising member of her people's scientific community, but her actions had led to her being ostracized, her status now in question. And yet, despite it all, she was determined to present the child as a beacon of hope, not a symbol of rebellion. "We have awaited your return, Zyra," the High Counselor's voice rang out, low and commanding. "But you have brought with you something unexpected." Zyra lifted her chin, meeting his gaze unwaveringly. "I have brought a future. A child that holds within it the potential to change our world, to unite the two species. It is not an aberration, Counselor. It is our legacy." The words hung in the air between them. Noah watched the council's reaction closely. Some members exchanged furtive glances, while others seemed to absorb Zyra's words with a calculated silence. "And you, human?" the High Counselor asked, turning to Noah. "What role do you play in this?" Noah met the counselor's gaze directly. "I am a doctor. I saved both Zyra and her child. I have sworn an oath to protect them, and I will continue to do so, no matter what you decide." The council's eyes flicked to each other again. The tension in the air was thick, palpable, as the weight of Noah's words seemed to sink in. The fate of the hybrid child and Zyra was now in their hands, and Noah knew, with a sense of dread, that the decision they made would reverberate across the galaxy. "Very well," the High Counselor finally said. "We will see what your child is capable of. But know this, Zyra. You will be judged, not just for what you have done, but for what you have created." The words were heavy with consequence, and Noah's heart raced as he followed Zyra into the heart of the council's domain, uncertain of what would come next. The grand hall where the High Council had gathered was unlike anything Noah had ever seen. The walls were made of smooth, polished obsidian, reflecting a muted light that seemed to emanate from nowhere. In the center of the room, a raised dais stood at the far end, surrounded by angular seats that held the High Council members. The air was thick with a heavy, palpable energy, and the silence that hung over the room felt almost oppressive. Zyra walked with purpose toward the dais, her posture regal despite the obvious weight of the moment. Noah followed closely behind her, his eyes scanning the room. The other Andhar officials stood in neat rows to the sides, their expressions unreadable. Each member of the council was an imposing figure, their tall, slender bodies dressed in flowing robes that shimmered under the dim light. Their eyes, intense and unblinking, followed every movement Zyra made, and Noah felt as though they were assessing him just as closely. As they approached the dais, the High Counselor, a being of immense stature and authority, stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Zyra. His skin shimmered with a pale, almost metallic hue, and his eyes glowed with the intensity of distant stars. He was an imposing figure, his presence commanding not just attention, but reverence. "You stand before us, Zyra," the High Counselor's voice rang out, low and resonant. "And you bring with you a challenge unlike any other our people have ever faced." Zyra met his gaze steadily, her eyes unwavering despite the heaviness in the air. "I do not seek to challenge you," she replied calmly. "I seek only to offer a future, one that could unite our species and forge a path forward." Noah stood beside Zyra, his hands clasped behind his back. The weight of the moment pressed on him as well, the uncertainty gnawing at the edges of his mind. The child that Zyra carried, the hybrid, was the key to everything. If the council saw it as a threat, it would be condemned. If they saw it as an opportunity, it could change the course of history. "We have heard your words, Zyra," the High Counselor continued, his voice carrying an air of judgment. "But words are not enough. We must see with our own eyes what this child is capable of." Zyra's face remained calm, but Noah could feel the subtle shift in her body. She was bracing herself for the scrutiny to come. He could only imagine the depths of her fears, the judgment she had lived with all her life, the weight of her people's expectations. She had already risked everything for this child, and now she stood on the precipice of even greater risks. "You must understand, Zyra," the High Counselor said, his tone more somber now. "Our people have spent millennia perfecting our genetic code, ensuring that our species remains pure, untainted by foreign influences. To introduce something that is not wholly Andhar into our gene pool, this is not a decision we take lightly." Zyra's expression hardened, and Noah could see the flicker of defiance in her eyes. "I do not ask you to change the core of what it means to be Andhar," she said, her voice firm. "But I ask you to see what this child can become. A hybrid may be the key to ensuring our future, a future where we are no longer bound by the rigid lines of our past." The council murmured amongst themselves, their voices low and indistinct, but their reactions were unmistakable. Skepticism, fear, and perhaps a hint of curiosity. "Enough," the High Counselor commanded, his voice cutting through the noise. "It is time for the child to be presented. Bring it forth." At his command, two attendants moved forward, bearing a transparent, spherical container in which the hybrid child floated within a life-supporting field. The container was a marvel of Andhar technology, its edges softly pulsing with light, indicating the vitality of its contents. The child, still in its early stages of development, was barely visible, but Noah could see enough to recognize the hybrid nature of the being. Its small, translucent form lacked the full features of a fully developed Andhar, but it was undeniably alive, and its growth was unlike anything Noah had ever encountered. Zyra's hand clenched at her side, but she didn't falter. She took a step forward, her gaze fixed on the child she carried, and Noah could feel the intensity of her love and protectiveness in that single glance. This was not just a biological experiment. This was her child, the future she had chosen to create. Noah stood beside Zyra, his eyes focused on the council as they regarded the child. The room was silent, each member of the High Council studying the hybrid with unwavering attention. Their eyes, calculating, inscrutable, seemed to weigh the life within the container against the traditions that had governed Anar society for centuries. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the High Counselor spoke again. His tone was still laden with authority, but there was a shift in his voice, a subtle recognition of something new, something that couldn't be ignored. "It is unlike anything we have seen before," the High Counselor said, his voice laced with awe. "But what we see is not the full measure of what this child will become. We must observe, study, and understand its potential. The Andar have never been afraid of the unknown, but we are bound by the principles that have sustained us for millennia." Zyra stepped forward, her eyes locked onto the High Counselor. "You say you are not afraid, but that is what you fear, the unknown. This child is the future. It is the bridge between our species, the culmination of what we could achieve together." For a long moment, the High Counselor said nothing. He stood there, unmoving, his gaze never wavering from the hybrid child. The tension in the room was palpable. And then, just when Noah thought the silence would suffocate them all, the counselor spoke again. "You are right, Zyra," the High Counselor said, his voice softer now, but still commanding. "We do not know what this child will become, but we are willing to allow time for the child to grow and show us what it is capable of." Zyra exhaled slowly, a mix of relief and exhaustion flooding her expression. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. "But," the High Counselor continued, his tone hardening once more, "this child will be monitored. It will not be allowed to grow unchecked. If it poses a threat to our species, if it becomes something we cannot control, we will not hesitate to take action." Zyra's shoulders stiffened at the threat, but Noah could see the resolve in her eyes. This was not the victory she had hoped for, but it was a victory nonetheless. The child would be allowed to live, at least for now, and that was all she could ask for. "I understand," Zyra said, her voice calm but firm, "and I will accept whatever judgment comes. But know this child is not a weapon. It is a hope, the hope of two worlds coming together, not tearing each other apart." The High Counselor's eyes softened, just for a moment. "We will see, Zyra. We will see." As the hybrid child was carefully carried away, Noah felt the weight of what they had just achieved. It wasn't a perfect victory, but it was a start. The child's future was uncertain, and so was the future of their species. But for the first time in a long while, there was hope, an ember of possibility, burning bright in the darkness. Days turned into weeks as Noah and Zyra adjusted to their new life on the Anar homeworld. The child, now named Kale, had grown rapidly, an unexpected consequence of the hybridization process. The child's development was not only physically accelerated but seemed to be marked by an intelligence beyond that of most Anar infants, and certainly far more advanced than Noah could have anticipated. Kale's eyes, bright, almost human in their expressiveness, followed him and Zyra wherever they went, a constant reminder of the future they had set in motion. Zyra remained resolute, but Noah could see the quiet strain in her. Though the council had granted the child's life, the terms of their agreement were clear. Kale would be observed, studied, and monitored closely. Every action was scrutinized, every interaction with the child weighed carefully. The fear of the unknown still hung in the air, and the council's patience, though granted, was not infinite. Time, it seemed, was both an ally and an enemy. Zyra had been given a modest residence within the city, an area isolated enough to provide some privacy, yet close enough to the heart of the Anar political and scientific institutions. It was in one of these quiet moments, as she stood by the windows overlooking the city, that Noah noticed a change in her. For so long, she had carried herself with the weight of her choices, the burden of the unknown future she had chosen. But now, as she watched Kale sleep peacefully in a cradle, there was something else in her eyes, an unspoken yearning for something more. "Do you think they'll ever accept Kale fully?" Noah asked quietly, his voice breaking the silence between them. Zyra turned, her gaze lingering on the sleeping child for a moment longer before meeting his eyes. "Acceptance is a complex thing, Noah," she said softly. "The Andar have always believed in the sanctity of our genes, our purity. What Kale represents challenges that belief in ways they are not ready to confront. It is not just his existence they fear, but what it means for everything they have ever known." Noah nodded, his heart heavy with the knowledge that their journey was far from over. "You know the risks. They could take him from you, they could—" "They will not," Zyra interjected firmly, her voice steady. "I will not let them." There was a fire in her words, a determination that had been absent during their earlier confrontations with the council. "Kale is my child. I will protect him with everything I am." The rawness of her emotions struck Noah deeply. She had already risked so much for the future of their child, but it was clear that she was not just fighting for Kale's survival. She was fighting for a future where two worlds could live together, side by side. It was an idea that had never been possible before, one that the Andar, in their perfectionist arrogance, had long dismissed. "We're not done yet, are we?" Noah said softly, his gaze fixed on Zyra. "Even if they accept him, even if they let him live, there's still the question of what happens next. Will the Andar truly change? Will they see Kale for what he is, a bridge, not a threat?" Zyra turned her gaze to the window once more, her expression distant, as if considering the vastness of the question. "I do not know," she said finally, her voice quieter now. "But I know that if we do not try, if we do not push against the tide, they will never see it. Kale will be the beginning, but only if we are willing to take the first steps, even when the path is uncertain." In the days that followed, Noah continued his work with the Andar medical team, assisting in the studies of the hybrid child. Kale's development was extraordinary, rapid growth, cognitive abilities that outstripped even the brightest of the Andar youth, and an almost uncanny ability to understand and communicate with both humans and Andar alike. It was both fascinating and deeply unsettling for many of the Andar scientists, who could not comprehend how something so far outside their cultural norms could function so seamlessly in their world. The first major test came when Kale, now barely a year old, was introduced to the wider Andar population. There had been a quiet expectation that this event would fail, that the child would somehow reveal itself to be less than what they had hoped for. But Kale surprised them all. As the child stood in the central square of the city, surrounded by curious onlookers, there was a stillness in the air. Zyra stood close by, her hand gently resting on Kale's shoulder, offering silent encouragement. Noah was beside her, watching the child, wondering what the future held. When Kale spoke, his voice clear, though still tinged with the innocence of youth, it sent a ripple through the gathered crowd. "I am Kale," the child said, his eyes locking onto the nearest Andar. "I am both of you and of him," he added, his small hand gesturing toward Noah. The crowd murmured in confusion, but there was no fear in Kale's voice, only a simple, honest declaration. The child's words were a moment of truth, an unspoken challenge to the beliefs that had shaped the Andar for millennia. And for the first time, Zyra felt a shift within her people. Weeks passed, and the tension in the air began to change. The High Council continued to watch, but they did not intervene. Something in the way Kale interacted with the world, his intelligence, his empathy, his understanding, began to chip away at the walls of fear that had once surrounded the Andar. Slowly, quietly, the whispers of hope began to circulate, but there were still those who doubted, still those who feared. Noah and Zyra continued to press forward, knowing that every small step was a victory. Each day that Kale lived and thrived was another day that they proved the potential of this hybrid child, this symbol of a future that was not confined by the past. But Noah could feel the weight of the question that still loomed. Would the Andar ever fully accept this future, or would they destroy it before it could even take root? Then, one day, the High Council called for a meeting, a final judgment on Kale's fate. Zyra stood beside Noah as they walked toward the council chamber, their hearts heavy with the uncertainty of what was to come. The room was filled with the same austere silence, but this time, there was a different energy in the air, one that seemed to shimmer with the possibility of change. The High Counselor stood before them, his gaze sharp as always, But there was something in his eyes that was different this time. "Zyra," he began, his voice measured but not harsh. "We have observed your child. We have seen his potential, his intelligence, and his capacity to connect with both our people and yours. And after much deliberation, we have reached a conclusion." Noah held his breath, unsure of what was coming next. "Kale will live," the High Counselor continued, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "He will be given the chance to grow, to prove his place among us. But this is not a decision made lightly, nor is it a concession. It is a step toward something greater, a future that we cannot yet see, but one that may one day shape the Endar as we know it." Zyra's expression softened, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. It was not a complete victory, but it was enough, a beginning. For the first time, she felt that the future was no longer defined by fear, but by the possibilities of what could be. The child she had given everything for was the symbol of change, of hope for both the Endar and humanity. The end. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more exciting HFY stories. Your support means the world to us. And make sure to tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Stay tuned for our next adventure, and until then, keep exploring the stars. See you in the next video.